You're kneeling in the mud at the edge of a marsh, 40,000 years before anyone will ever write a word. Your fingers are raw. Your stomach hasn't stopped growling in 2 days. And in your hand is a fistful of wild grass seeds that everyone else in your group thinks are worthless. They're not wrong to think that. Raw wild grain is hard, bitter, and barely digestible. You could eat 100 of these seeds and still feel like your body is eating itself. But something in you, some flicker of instinct or desperation, makes you press one of those seeds between 2 stones. And when you do, something changes that will eventually change the entire species. This isn't a story about farming. Forget everything you think you know about ancient humans discovering agriculture, and then suddenly baking bread like it was the next logical step. That version of history is wrong. Actually, it's backwards. And once you hear what scientists actually dug up in the deserts of Jordan, you'll understand why archaeologists had to rewrite the timeline of human civilization completely. Here's the part nobody tells you. Humans were making bread 11,000 years before we ever planted a single crop on purpose. Read that again. Bread came first. Farming came after. For decades, the accepted theory was simple. Humans settled down, started growing wheat, and only then figured out you could grind it into flour and cook it into something edible. Neat. Logical. Completely false. You're not just watching a story about food. You're watching the moment a starving, wandering species stumbled onto a technology so powerful it would eventually build cities, start wars, create kings, and reshape the human body itself. And it started with someone exactly like you, exhausted, hungry, kneeling by a fire that hasn't given them a real meal in far too long. Picture the world around you. There's no wheat field. No neat rows of golden stalks swaying in the wind like you'd imagine. Just wild grasses scattered across a hillside, growing wherever the rain happened to fall that season. You don't own this land. Nobody does. The idea of owning a field hasn't been invented yet. You just know that some years, when the rains come at the right time, this patch of ground gives you seeds that keep you alive through the winter. Gathering those seeds is brutal work. You crouch for hours pulling grass heads through your fingers, dropping tiny seeds into a woven basket that took days to make. A single meal's worth of grain might take an entire morning to collect. Your knees ache, your fingers bleed, and even after all that effort, the seeds you've gathered are almost impossible to eat as they are. So what do you do with something you can't chew, can't digest, and can't afford to waste? You do what humans have always done when survival is on the line. You experiment. You try soaking the seeds in water. You try roasting them over the fire until they crack. And at some point, someone, maybe you, maybe someone before you whose name is lost forever, takes 2 flat stones and starts grinding. This is the moment that changes everything, and almost nobody talks about it. Grinding grain between stones isn't just a cooking technique. It's the birth of processed food. The first time in human history that raw material from nature gets transformed into something the human body couldn't access on its own. You're not just eating anymore. You're engineering your food. But here's what scientists actually found when they dug into the ruins of an ancient campsite called Shubayqa, tucked into the black basalt desert of northeastern Jordan. They uncovered tiny charred crumbs, no bigger than a fingernail, sitting in an ancient fireplace. First, they looked like nothing. Burnt debris, the kind of thing you'd sweep away without a second glance. Except those crumbs weren't nothing. When researchers examined them under a scanning electron microscope, the structure was unmistakable. Elongated air pockets, a honeycomb texture, the exact fingerprint of dough that had been mixed, worked, and cooked. In other words, bread. Real bread. 14,400 years old, give or take a few centuries. Let that number sit with you for a second. 14,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel, before anyone had ever domesticated a single grain of wheat. Humans sitting around a fire in the desert had already figured out how to turn wild seeds into something resembling the bread sitting in your kitchen right now. And this is where the story stops being a fun fact and starts being genuinely unsettling, because it forces a question none of us like asking. If bread didn't come from farming, then farming might have come from bread. The thing we assumed was a side effect of agriculture might actually be one of the reasons agriculture happened in the first place. Think about what that means for a second. For 100,000 years, humans wandered, foraged, hunted, and moved with the seasons. Then, in a tiny corner of the Middle East, someone discovers that grinding wild grain into flour and cooking it produces something worth the backbreaking labor of gathering it. Something dense in calories. Something that could be stored. Something that tasted, in a world with almost no reliable food, like magic. And once a taste like that exists, humans do something deeply, uncomfortably human. They start chasing it. Not because they need to survive the next day, they already know how to do that. They chase it because they want more of it, and wanting more of a specific taste is one of the oldest, strongest forces driving human behavior, then and now. Does that sound familiar? It should. That craving, the pull toward a specific flavor, a specific texture, a specific hit of carbohydrate and warmth, is the exact same mechanism sitting behind why you can't walk past a bakery without slowing down. Why just one slice of bread never actually stays at one slice. 14,000 years of evolution built that craving into you long before you were born, and it hasn't gone anywhere. But let's rewind, because the invention itself is stranger and messier than a single aha moment. Grinding grain into flour is only step one. Flour and water alone gives you a flat, dense paste, closer to a cracker than anything you'd recognize as bread. The thing that actually transforms dough into bread, the thing that makes it rise, soften, and develop that unmistakable structure, is something ancient humans couldn't see, couldn't explain, and definitely didn't understand. Wild yeast, invisible microorganisms floating in the air, living on the surface of grains, waiting in the cracks of a clay bowl left out overnight. Nobody in that desert camp knew what a microorganism was. There was no concept of biology, of fermentation, of bacteria feeding on sugar and releasing gas as a byproduct. And yet, somehow, it happened anyway. Picture it. A bowl of flour and water gets left out longer than intended, maybe forgotten, maybe deliberately set aside for tomorrow. Hours pass, and when someone comes back to it, the mixture looks different. It's puffier. It smells sharp, almost sour, unlike anything they've smelled before. Most instincts would say throw it out. Something's wrong with it. But somebody somewhere decided to cook it anyway. That decision, the choice to trust something that looked off instead of discarding it, might be one of the single bravest culinary experiments in human history, and the person who made it never knew what they'd just done. The bread that came out of that fire wasn't flat and dense anymore. It was lighter, softer. It held air inside itself. It was, without either of them knowing it, the first leavened bread on earth. This is where you have to stop and ask yourself an uncomfortable question. How many mistakes have you thrown away in your own life because they looked wrong, smelled strange, or didn't match what you expected? Ancient humans survived, in part, because someone was willing to eat the weird thing instead of tossing it. That instinct, cautious curiosity instead of pure fear, might be one of the most underrated survival tools your ancestors ever developed. And once fermentation entered the picture, bread stopped being just food. It became something closer to a discovery engine. The same wild yeast that leavened bread could also ferment grain into something else entirely. A primitive beer, thick and cloudy, nothing like what you drink today, but unmistakably alcoholic. Some archaeologists now argue that fermented grain drinks and bread may have developed side by side, practically twins born from the same accidental process. That theory has actually split the archaeological world into two camps, and the argument gets more intense than you'd expect for something about ancient snacks. One side says bread came first, purely as sustenance, because starving people don't waste effort brewing beer before they've solved basic hunger. The other side argues that early humans may have deliberately cultivated wild grasses not for food at all, but to guarantee a steady supply of alcohol for rituals and gatherings. Either way, the implications are strange enough to sit with. It's entirely possible that one of the driving forces behind the beginning of agriculture wasn't hunger. It might have been the desire to get a group of people fed, relaxed, and bonded together around a fire with something that altered how they felt. If that's true, then the foundation of human civilization wasn't built purely on survival logic. It was built, at least partly, on the human desire to feel good together. Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like a Friday night? Humans gathering around food and drink, bonding over something that changes how their brains feel, building social connection through a shared ritual of eating and drinking. That pattern didn't disappear when the last hunter-gatherer societies vanished. You're living inside a version of it right now, every time food and drink bring people together in your own life. What you're about to hear next was hidden from history books for most of the 20th century, buried under a much cleaner, much more comfortable version of the story that most textbooks still repeat. For decades, the accepted narrative was almost triumphant. Humans invented farming, farming led to surplus food led to villages, villages led to cities, and cities led to everything we now call civilization. A straight line upward. Progress as an unstoppable staircase. But that clean narrative conveniently skips over what farming actually did to the human body, and once you know it, you'll never look at a slice of bread quite the same way again. When researchers compare the skeletons of hunter-gatherers to the skeletons of early farmers who lived just a few thousand years later, the difference isn't subtle. It's brutal. Hunter-gatherer skeletons show tall, strong bodies, varied diets, and remarkably few signs of chronic disease. Early farming skeletons, by contrast, show shorter stature, worse teeth, more signs of malnutrition, and skeletal evidence of relentless repetitive labor, the kind of physical where you'd expect from someone doing the same brutal task day after day for their entire life. Grinding grain into flour by hand, for hours every single day, leaves a very specific kind of damage on human bones. Archaeologists can literally see it. Here's the sentence that should stop you cold. Farming didn't necessarily make ancient life easier. In many documented cases, it made life harder, shorter, and more physically punishing than it had been for the wandering foragers who came before. The invention that we associate with progress, comfort, and civilization may have actually made the average human life worse for thousands of years before it eventually made it better. So why did anyone stick with it? Why didn't early humans just go back to hunting and gathering the second farming started grinding down their bodies and teeth? The answer is uncomfortable, and it says something about human psychology that's still true today. Once a population grows dependent on a stored, reliable food source like grain, going back becomes almost impossible. More mouths to feed, more bodies relying on the same fields, less room to simply pack up and return to the old way of life. In other words, the trap wasn't food scarcity. The trap was food security. The very thing that was supposed to make life safer became the thing that locked people into a harder existence they couldn't easily escape. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern behind why so many modern conveniences quietly increase our workload instead of decreasing it. Why time-saving technology so often leaves people busier, not freer. And this is where bread's story stops being charming and starts turning genuinely dark. Because grain wasn't just food. Grain was the first thing in human history that could be stockpiled, hoarded, counted, and controlled. You can't hoard a herd of wild animals running loose across a plain. You can't stockpile fruit that rots in a week. But dried grain can sit in a pit or a clay jar for months, sometimes years, without spoiling. The moment humans figured out how to store surplus grain, they accidentally invented something far more dangerous than bread. They invented the concept of controllable wealth. For the first time in the history of the species, one person or one family or one group could physically hold more food than everyone around them, and everyone else would know it. Before grain storage, most hunter-gatherer societies were remarkably, almost radically, equal. You couldn't really hoard meat before it rotted. You couldn't stockpile berries for a decade. Resources moved through the group because keeping them didn't make sense. But grain broke that entire system. Grain could be locked away. Grain could be guarded. Grain could be denied to people who used to have equal access to everything. And once you can deny food to another human being, you gain power over them in a way that simply didn't exist before. Archaeologists studying the earliest grain-based societies have found something chilling hiding in the evidence. The first clear signs of social hierarchy, inequality, and even early forms of forced labor appear almost exactly alongside the first evidence of large-scale grain storage. Not centuries later, practically at the same time. Here's the piece that almost nobody puts in the fun facts about bread videos, because it's not fun at all. Some researchers now argue that grain, and by extension bread, may have been one of the very first tools of control ever used by one human being over another. Whoever controlled the grain store controlled who ate, and whoever controlled who ate controlled who worked, who obeyed, and who survived the winter. Sit with that for a second, because it flips the entire emotional tone of this story. That warm, comforting loaf sitting in your kitchen has roots not just in survival and community, but in one of the earliest known systems of human power and control. The same invention that fed starving people around a fire also became, thousands of years later, one of the first currencies of dominance the species had ever known. This is the part that should genuinely make you rethink your instincts about progress. We're taught to think of every ancient invention as an unambiguous step forward. Fire, tools, agriculture, bread, all filed neatly under human achievement. But almost every major leap in prehistoric technology came with a hidden cost that historians conveniently leave out of the highlight reel. Bread fed millions. Bread also, quietly and gradually, helped build the first cages of human hierarchy. And the physical cost didn't stop with bent spines and worn teeth. As grain-based diets spread, something else changed inside the human body that took modern science thousands of years to fully understand. Diets built heavily around processed grain are far more calorie-dense and far less nutritionally complete than the wildly varied diets hunter-gatherers relied on. Populations that shifted to grain-heavy diets saw spikes in tooth decay, nutrient deficiencies, and once populations grew dense enough, the first waves of infectious disease outbreaks tied to crowded, settled living. Here's the twist most people never connect. Living in one place, surrounded by stored grain, surrounded by domesticated animals, surrounded by waste that no longer got left behind when the group moved on. That's the exact recipe for the birth of epidemic disease. The very stability that grain and bread provided also created the conditions for humanity's first plagues. Comfort and catastrophe, born from the exact same invention. Does any of this sound distant, safely locked away in prehistory? It shouldn't. Because right now, in your own life, the descendants of that same wild grain your ancestors ground between two stones make up an enormous percentage of what you eat every single day. Refined flour, processed carbohydrates, foods engineered, quite literally, using the same base logic as 14,000 years ago, to be dense, calorie-rich, and almost impossible to stop eating once you start. The food industry didn't invent your craving for bread. It inherited it. Every study on why humans find bread, pasta, and refined carbohydrates so difficult to resist points back to the exact same neurological reward pathways that would have kept a starving forager alive 14,000 years ago. Your brain doesn't know the famine is over. As far as your deepest, oldest instincts are concerned, dense, carbohydrate-rich food is still the difference between surviving the winter and not. That's the third time this story has quietly connected an ancient survival instinct to something happening in your life today, and it won't be the last. Because that's really what this entire story is about. It's not really about bread. It's about how deeply ancient survival mechanisms are still steering modern human behavior, whether we notice it or not. Now here's the darkest thread in the whole story, the one archaeologists tend to mention quietly, almost as a footnote, because it's uncomfortable enough to overshadow everything else. Some of the earliest large grain storage sites ever discovered show signs of deliberate destruction. Burned granaries, deliberately smashed storage jars, evidence consistent with raids rather than accidents. In other words, some of the very first organized human conflicts we have physical evidence for weren't fought over land, or mates, or territory in the way we usually imagine. They were fought over bread. Or more precisely, over the grain that would eventually become bread. Once a community had something worth stealing, something dense, storable, and life-sustaining, other communities had a reason to take it by force. The invention that fed people also, almost immediately, gave people a reason to kill each other. That's not a footnote. That might be one of the most important, least discussed turning points in the entire story of human civilization. The first loaf of bread wasn't just a triumph of human ingenuity. It was also, whether anyone intended it or not, the opening. Move in a pattern of hoarding, controlling, and fighting over food resources that has never fully stopped since. Every war ever fought partly over resources, every empire built partly on controlling food supply, every modern conversation about food insecurity and inequality. The roots reach back to a fire in the desert and a fistful of ground-up wild grass. So think about what you're really holding the next time you pick up a piece of bread. It's not just flour, water, and yeast. It's the physical descendant of one of the oldest technologies our species ever developed, older than farming, older than writing, older than almost every institution you've ever been taught to associate with the birth of civilization. It fed the first fires of human community, and it may have also lit the first fires of human conflict and control. Ancient humans didn't set out to invent inequality. They didn't set out to invent epidemics or hierarchy or hoarding. They set out to solve one simple, brutal problem. How do you keep a body alive when the world isn't guaranteed to feed you tomorrow? Everything else, the good and the deeply unsettling, grew out from that one desperate, hungry decision to grind a seed between two stones instead of throwing it away. And maybe that's the most human part of this entire story. Every major leap your ancestors ever made came from the same place. Not grand ambition, but quiet, stubborn desperation refusing to give up in front of an empty stomach. The bread on your table tonight carries 14,000 years of that desperation inside it, baked so deep into human history that most people will never think about it again after they finish this sentence. So the next time you tear off a piece of warm bread without thinking twice, remember what you're actually holding. Not just a meal, a 14,000-year-old survival strategy, a quiet engine of human civilization, and, if the evidence is right, one of the very first tools humans ever used to control each other. All of it, hiding in something as ordinary as a slice of bread sitting on your kitchen counter right now.